inside a luxury store built on elegance and assumption. Big Shaq walked in, not for attention, but to observe the world he quietly owned. When the luxury store woman stopped him, judgment spoke louder than truth. One quiet line shifted everything. "You sure you want to do this here?" What followed wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning. Because sometimes the one they try to shame built the very empire they're guarding. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. A towering figure stepped out of a matte black SUV that went unnoticed amid the morning bustle. Dressed in a gray hoodie, dark joggers, and scuffed sneakers, he didn't turn heads, not at first. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq to those who once watched him rule the courts, had long left the arena. In this life he walked with quieter purpose. No entourage, no cameras, no press releases. He had become a silent owner in multiple ventures, including Verite Luxe, one of the most prestigious luxury retail chains in the country. But today, he wasn't there for business. Today, he just wanted to walk. He stepped through the automatic doors, met by a waft of warm, cedar-scented air. The space was pristine. Marble floors gleamed beneath soft lighting. Walls lined with curated art, and handcrafted displays showcased items that cost more than most people's rent. The store felt more like a museum of opulence than a retail space. Shaq didn't need anything. That wasn't why he came. Some mornings he simply liked to revisit the ground floor, to stay human, to feel things again without the screen of wealth and status. He strolled slowly, his massive frame moving gently between aisles of designer watches and Italian leather goods. Near the fragrance section, a little boy no older than 7 was squatting by the glass shelves, his nose nearly pressed against the cologne bottles. The boy's mother was a few feet away, distracted by a sales associate offering her a champagne flute. As the boy reached up, wobbling to touch one of the smaller bottles, he lost balance. Shaq moved instantly. With the grace of a man half his size, he caught the child mid-stumble before the glass could shatter. "Got you," he said gently, helping the boy steady himself. The boy looked up, wide-eyed, blinking at the giant before him. "Whoa, you're really tall." Shaq smiled. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The mother turned sharply, eyes flaring in alarm, but her panic eased the second she saw her son unharmed. She murmured a quick thank you to Shaq, not recognizing who he was. That was fine with him. He wandered onward, deeper into the store. Near the rear entrance, beside the less trafficked alcove where promotional stock was often stored, sat an older man bundled in a threadbare coat. He wasn't part of the staff, clearly homeless, tucked into a quiet corner with a coffee cup in hand. Shaq paused. "Danny," he said with a warm nod. The man looked up with a toothy grin. "Shaq, my man. I was hoping you'd come by today. You always sneak in like a ghost." Shaq chuckled, reaching into his hoodie pocket. He pulled out a foil-wrapped sandwich and handed it over. "Turkey and cheddar, extra pickles." "You remembered," Danny said, accepting the gift with hands that trembled slightly. "Ain't nobody remember like you do." "You're somebody," Shaq said softly. "I see." That exchange, simple and small, was the heartbeat of who he had become. In the corners of excess, Shaq carried a different kind of wealth, one built on listening, on remembering, on showing up. As he turned back toward the showroom, something shifted in the air. A subtle tightness crept into the silence. His steps slowed, instincts kicking in. The staff's chatter behind the counters dimmed slightly. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. It was as if the store itself had tensed. He caught it in fragments. A sideways glance from a young associate near the handbags. A quick whisper between 2 team leads. Then the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not admired, watched, as though he didn't belong. As though, despite the $1 million suits he'd once commissioned for this very display floor, his hoodie and sneakers made him suspect. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't the first time. He paused near the men's footwear section, eyes scanning a new line of custom high tops he had signed off on just months prior. His name wasn't on them, but his influence was in every stitch. He knelt slightly, running a fingertip along the edge of the suede. Behind him, a store radio clicked on, then off. He glanced up at the ceiling camera above. A red light blinked once. Someone was watching. There was no welcome, no "can I help you find something?" Not from the staff. Not from the floor manager who had now appeared behind the jewelry counter, pretending to reorganize rings while keeping him in peripheral view. Shaq stood, brushed invisible dust from his hoodie, and moved on. Near the cashmere section, a young employee nearly collided with him as she came around the corner too fast. Her eyes widened. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you there." He smiled kindly. "No harm done." But she didn't smile back. She turned quickly, retreating to the manager. Shaq felt the rhythm of the store shift further. It was a kind of silent alarm. The way luxury places sometimes closed ranks when a figure didn't match the setting. He had seen it before. He had fought it before. And still it hit like a bruise. He passed a mirror near the leather goods. In his reflection he saw what they saw. A massive man in casual clothes. Unknown, unreadable. Standing where exclusivity was supposed to reign. But he also saw something else. A glint in his own eyes that said, "I see you too." Outside the wind picked up. Pedestrians passed by the front windows. Life went on. Inside the store, the golden silence stretched longer. Attention, almost invisible but undeniably present, snaked through the air vents and polished marble. Shaq turned toward the staircase that led to the upper VIP lounge, a space only top-tier clientele ever entered. He wasn't going up there today. Not yet. He wanted to see how far the silence would carry. How deep the judgment ran. As he headed back toward the center atrium, he spotted a familiar face approaching from behind a velvet partition. A man in a tailored navy suit, well-groomed, sharp-eyed, moving like someone who held weight in the company. He walked with purpose, phone in one hand, earbud in place. Shaq slowed for a moment, watching him. But the man didn't even glance Shaq's way. Instead, the suited figure continued walking, directly toward the store's private elevator behind the security desk. The doors opened. He stepped inside and was gone. Shaq stood in place for a beat longer than necessary. Something about that man struck a chord. Something buried. But before he could unpack it, a voice cut through the silence from across the store. "Excuse me, sir." He turned. A woman in a pristine black blazer approached, holding a sleek tablet and wearing a too bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read Chelsea Rourke, assistant manager. "We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding your presence in the store." Her tone was sharp, professional, cold. Shaq met her eyes, calm but unreadable. The golden silence had just been broken. Chelsea Rourke stood inside the security monitoring room, flanked by walls of screens and blinking LED panels. Her eyes were locked on screen 6, zoomed in on a figure walking through the main showroom floor of Verite Luxe. He was massive, dressed in a worn hoodie and sweats, hands casually tucked in his pockets, stopping here and there to inspect items on display. His presence felt different, not just because of his size. Something about the way he moved. Not like a customer, like someone too comfortable, too quiet, too still. "Who's that?" she asked. Her voice clipped and cold, the way it always was when she was irritated. She tapped a sharp nail against the console as she zoomed the camera further in. "That guy? No idea," replied Connor, the store's junior tech assistant, who was half-eaten into a sandwich and not paid nearly enough to be as alert as she wanted him to be. "He doesn't look like he belongs in here." Chelsea narrowed her eyes. "The clothes, the shoes, not even close to our clientele." Connor shrugged. "Could be a tourist. Or maybe just low-key rich." Chelsea didn't laugh. Instead, she pressed a button and patched into the floor's private comms line. "Floor team, be advised," she said clearly, her voice slicing through the store's earpieces like a scalpel. "Suspicious male in the men's shoe section. Oversized hoodie, gray sweats. Possible loitering, possibly scouting merchandise." She didn't think twice. She didn't ask anyone to engage. Not yet. She just wanted eyes. And in her world, eyes were control. The thing about Chelsea Rourke was that she had built her career on polish and performance. Her appearance was impeccable. Hair sleeked into a sculpted bun, blazer pressed to perfection, lipstick matte and blood red. To the customers, she was the vision of professionalism, refinement, and luxury intelligence. But beneath the sheen was a calculating ambition she wore like armor. She'd fought her way up in a world where every woman had to be twice as smart, twice as polished, and 5 times more ruthless. There was no room for mistakes, and certainly no room for suspicious behavior on her watch. On the screen, the man Shaq knelt near a display of high-end sneakers, running his hand along the leather sole with the kind of care most people didn't associate with men of his size or dress. She didn't recognize him. That in itself was enough to trigger her reflexes. Anyone with the money to afford those sneakers usually had a profile in their client database. And this man wasn't pinging any alerts. Another camera angle caught him smiling at a child. Then another showed him laughing quietly near the store's far rear entrance. But Chelsea wasn't moved. She saw what she needed to see. "Griffin," she said into her earpiece. "Shadow him. Discreetly. Let's make sure he's not here to make trouble." "Yes, ma'am," came the low reply from the store's senior associate. A well-trained, smooth-talking man who had no issue acting like security when called upon. He moved swiftly, blending into the flow of customers with a calculated nonchalance. Chelsea watched Griffin approach from a distance. Shaq seemed unaware or was pretending to be. The cameras caught every angle. Griffin pretending to browse near Shaq, Chelsea watching them both from above. And a third angle from the luxury watch section, where the store's mood began shifting. Other employees noticed the man too. Conversations paused, glances were exchanged, and even some of the regular customers began observing the shift in energy. And still Chelsea never questioned the assumption she'd already made. Her instinct wasn't curiosity. It was control. From her elevated post, she adjusted another camera toward the back hallway, just for a second, revealing a narrow corridor mostly unseen by guests. It ended at a smooth gold-plated wall, embedded with a digital keypad. That door was never mentioned to customers. Only upper management knew what lay behind it. A private archive and design room used by the company's co-founders and board members. Chelsea had never been inside. Rumor had it only one man outside the board had access, and no one had seen him in person in years. She turned her gaze back to the monitor. Shaq had moved again, now standing in front of the cologne section. She squinted as he reached up and picked up a bottle of limited edition scent, one of only 20 made globally. He read the label, studied the glass, then set it back down gently. "Griffin, status?" Chelsea asked, tension beginning to harden in her chest. "He's calm, not taking anything. Just looking around. He's been here too long." Griffin hesitated. "He hasn't done anything, Chels." "That's not your call," she snapped. "If he's not buying, he's wasting our time or scouting. Engage." Griffin was quiet for a moment before replying. "Understood." Chelsea watched as Griffin made his way toward Shaq. The camera didn't have audio, but she could read the body language. Griffin leaned in with a practiced smile. Shaq responded with something cool, casual, maybe even kind. Griffin straightened, said something else. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't argue, just nodded once, like a man already familiar with the whole routine. Chelsea's mouth thinned into a straight line. "Connor," she said, "check for outstanding alerts or banned guests. I want facial recognition cross-checked with our restricted access list." Connor blinked. "That's kind of extreme, isn't it?" "Do it." Connor sighed and ran the scan, the system humming softly as it processed. Meanwhile, Chelsea stepped out of the security room and walked briskly across the showroom floor. Every step she took echoed softly on the polished stone beneath her heels. Her presence turned heads, the kind of attention she both demanded and manipulated with ease. When she reached the shoe section, Griffin gave a slight nod and stepped aside. Shaq was still standing there, now thumbing through a slim leather wallet. "Good afternoon, sir," Chelsea said smoothly, smiling with the edge of a blade. "Is there anything I can assist you with today?" Shaq glanced up. His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "Just looking." "Well, I appreciate your interest. This section is reserved for clients with pre-approved appointments, but of course we're happy to make accommodations for serious buyers." Shaq said nothing, just slid his wallet back into his pocket and looked at her, the way a storm might watch a weatherman. She hesitated, then took a step closer. "If you're not planning to make a purchase today, I'll kindly ask that you allow our staff to assist other customers." Still, no resistance, no anger, just that same, unreadable calm. Her voice sharpened. "I'll need to inspect the contents of your bag." It wasn't a request. Customers nearby slowed. A few glanced over. One began filming on her phone, trying to be discreet. Shaq didn't move for a beat. Then he opened his bag slowly, holding it out with deliberate care. Chelsea looked inside. Nothing but a notebook, a water bottle, and what looked like a protein bar. No merchandise, no tags, no stolen goods. Still, she let the moment hang. She closed the bag gently and met his eyes again. "That will be all," she said. Shaq took back his bag. "You sure you want to do this here?" His voice was deep, low and calm, like someone asking a question that didn't need an answer. Chelsea didn't respond. Across the floor, a tall man in a tailored suit emerged from the upper gallery, watching from above, his face unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, just observed. Chelsea didn't notice him, not yet. Shaq adjusted the strap of his bag and nodded once, not to Chelsea but to himself. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator, near the private corridor. Chelsea turned sharply and walked away, brushing off the attention of two employees who tried to ask if everything was all right. She went straight back to the security room. "Did you run that scan?" she asked Connor, breathing a little harder now. Connor was staring at his screen, confused. "What?" she asked again. "There's nothing. He's not in the restricted list, not flagged." But what?" Connor hesitated, eyes narrowing. "There's a name on the executive ownership list. Partial match. The original investor behind this flagship location. But that's gotta be a glitch. That guy's a ghost." Chelsea stared at him. "What name?" Connor turned the screen to her. "Shaquille R. O'Neal, executive co-founder, Verity Looks Holdings." The room went still. Chelsea blinked once. Then the screen flicked again, and camera 8 showed Shaq stepping calmly into the private elevator behind the golden wall. The elevator doors whispered open behind the golden-plated panel, releasing Shaq back into the main showroom, with a quiet whoosh that barely stirred the polished air. He stepped out slowly, his eyes scanning the refined layout before him. Shelves of exotic fragrances, glass domes covering limited edition watches, subtle light bouncing off the marble floors like sunlight on still water. Even now, it felt surreal. He had helped design the layout, chosen the music that floated through hidden ceiling speakers, signed off on the scent that lingered subtly in the air. Everything had been carefully considered, not for ostentation, but for elegance. But today, none of it felt welcoming. He took a few steps into the central aisle, pausing near the leather section. A handcrafted weekender bag caught his eye. He remembered the pitch meeting vividly. How he'd argued for a brushed brass zipper instead of chrome, because brass aged with character. The board had debated it for 20 minutes. He had stood firm. Now here it sat, bathed in spotlight, the detail exactly as he'd imagined. But no one knew that. Not here. Not now. Shaq moved slowly, not browsing with intent to buy, but with something closer to reverence. Every section held a story. The shoe display near the west wall. He'd approved its geometric angles because he said shoes were art, and art needed framing. The cologne shelf? His mother had always taught him scent mattered more than people thought. It was memory in liquid form. He'd chosen that exact corner to house the fragrances, because it was the warmest pocket in the store. Less draft, better preservation. But as he walked, the warmth faded. The subtle tension he had felt earlier began to thicken. This time not just from the staff. Customers were noticing him. Not in the wide-eyed way fans used to recognize him on the street. These glances were different. Quick, appraising, nervous. A woman with a gold-plated clutch stepped back as he passed. She turned slightly, tucking her purse under her arm, angling her body away from him while pretending to scroll through her phone. Her husband, tall, balding, in a trench coat, whispered something behind her, and they both veered into another aisle without looking back. Shaq let out a slow breath. A little girl around 5 years old peeked out from behind a mannequin, her eyes sparkling. She gave a wide, toothy grin and waved. Shaq smiled back instinctively, giving her a small wave in return, but her mother's hand snatched her away instantly. The smile dropped from the child's face, replaced with confusion as she was ushered quickly behind a row of bags. Shaq stood still. It was always subtle, never overt, never loud. That was how judgment moved in spaces like these. Quiet as silk, cold as snow, and it still landed heavy. He walked toward the central atrium, where the ceiling opened into a vaulted dome. There were no skylights. This store was all illusion, carefully lit from within, but the architecture gave the sensation of openness. It was the spot where years ago, he'd first imagined hosting charity fundraisers and scholarship galas. A space where elegance could meet generosity. Now he felt watched, not admired, not even feared. Just managed. He stepped closer to a rotating display of high-end sneakers, each suspended on thin steel rods, like sculpted art. A young employee stood nearby, pretending to organize the tags. He was well-groomed, sharply dressed, and trying very hard to look busy while watching every one of Shaq's movements. Shaq picked up a sneaker, turning it slowly in his hand. It was part of the Legacy collection, a tribute line inspired by athletes who had redefined culture. He remembered suggesting the idea 2 years ago. The brand had run with it. His name had never appeared on the press release. From the corner of his eye, Shaq saw the employee approach. "Can I help you with something, sir?" the man asked, his voice polite but taut, like a rubber band stretched near its limit. Shaq glanced at his name tag. "Griffin." "I'm good," Shaq said evenly, placing the shoe back on the rod. Griffin didn't move. "These pieces aren't usually handled, unless a customer is prepared to purchase. I can have someone assist you if you're interested." Shaq raised an eyebrow slightly. "I know the policy." Griffin blinked, caught off guard. "Right, of course." For a beat, silence hung between them. Griffin's composure shifted. A slight hardening, not aggression, caution, like a man walking a rope he didn't know was frayed. "I just want to make sure everything's in order," he added quickly. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Everything's in order." Griffin hesitated. "If you have questions about pricing or sizes, I can direct you to our concierge team." Shaq's lips tightened. "You think I can't afford these?" The words weren't loud, but they struck like thunder. Griffin stiffened. "No, sir, I didn't mean." Shaq waved him off. "Don't worry, I've seen this movie before." Griffin stepped back slightly, unsure of what to say. Then Shaq turned, walking away without another glance. The encounter might have ended there. Just another friction point smoothed over with polite dismissal. But the energy had shifted. Other staff were watching now. The whispers spread. Eyes darted from employee to employee. The quiet murmur of suspicion had now grown legs. Shaq moved past the handbags, past the accessory bar. He paused briefly to admire a limited edition belt, one with an engraved clasp he'd commissioned for a charity gala 3 years back. The irony wasn't lost on him. He thought of his mother then, Lucille O'Neill, the woman who had shaped him, who'd taught him in a world that would sometimes only see his skin, or his size, that restraint was not weakness, that dignity didn't always wear a crown, that sometimes silence spoke loudest. He remembered sitting on a splintered bench as a boy, just outside a diner in Louisiana, where they wouldn't let them sit inside. He'd wanted to scream, wanted to throw something. And Lucille had said, "Baby, you don't need to raise your voice to raise the bar. Let them wonder why you're smiling when they expect you to snap." And so he walked, with calm, with purpose, through aisles where he had once envisioned dreams, and was now walking through judgment. From the far end of the showroom, behind the concierge podium, he saw Chelsea Rourke return from the security room. Her heels struck the floor like a metronome, her spine perfectly straight. She was speaking to someone on a wireless earpiece, but her eyes briefly flicked to Shaq as she passed. Recognition flickered, not of who he was, but what she thought he was. Shaq turned toward the exit. Not because he was done, but because he wasn't finished yet. As he passed the fragrance section, he caught another employee hastily typing on a tablet. His name didn't appear in their system, not as a shopper, not as a VIP, because he didn't need it to. The owners weren't listed on the sales floor. That was the point. Silent investment, silent oversight. But today, silence was only half the story. He paused once more, at the center of the store, letting the energy swirl around him. The judgment, the calculation, the invisible scale tipping back and forth in people's minds. How quickly comfort turned into suspicion. How quickly presence became problem. And yet he stood, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with memory. He touched the collar of his hoodie, adjusted it slightly, then began walking again, this time toward the back hallway, past the velvet ropes, past the display cases, past the gold-plated wall. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be a repeat. It would be a reckoning. Her heels clicked sharp against the marble, cutting a clean path through a crowd that instinctively parted for her. Jaw tight, tablet clutched against her hip like a shield. She was elegant and deliberate, an executive presence with a dagger in her voice. She had reviewed the footage twice. She had listened to Griffin's uncertain tone. It wasn't enough. The man, tall, wide, cloaked in casual defiance, was still in her store, and that alone was reason enough to act. She didn't just protect Verite Lux's brand. She was the brand, and the brand did not tolerate questions that lingered unanswered. She spotted him near the center of the store again. The crowd gave him space, but the air felt tense, a little too still. He wasn't moving, just standing there calmly, eyes locked on a sleek display of watches. His posture was unreadable, relaxed, almost bored. But to Chelsea it was a quiet challenge, a refusal to shrink. She approached, her voice crisp, without invitation. "Sir," she said, her tone just loud enough to carry over the ambient music. "I'm going to need to inspect your bag." The man didn't move. She stopped in front of him, hands composed in front of her, expression perfectly rehearsed. Around them, customers slowed their steps, circling without circling. Phones rose discreetly, lenses capturing the unfolding confrontation from multiple angles. This wasn't just an encounter, it was becoming an event. Shaq met her eyes. Something about the way he looked at her made her hesitate just half a second. Not fear, not hostility. Something deeper, something familiar. Still, she pressed forward. "We've had reports of suspicious behavior," she added, careful not to raise her voice. "Company policy allows us to request bag checks if there's probable concern." The words were precise, rehearsed from corporate scripts she knew by heart. Her tone was professional, but it carried that subtle undertone. The assumption built on the idea that someone like him didn't belong here. She didn't recognize the weight of her own bias. Or maybe she did, and had simply dressed it in procedure. Shaq gave a small nod. His shoulders didn't tense, his hands didn't clench, but something in his chest sank. That familiar sting. It wasn't the request, it was the setting. The assumption. The performance of suspicion dressed up as professionalism. He lowered his bag slowly, methodically, not because he was afraid, but because restraint had been carved into his bones since childhood. The crowd leaned closer, breath hitched in anticipation. A few people began filming more boldly now, emboldened by the spectacle. Verite Lux wasn't known for drama, which made this all the more compelling. Shaq unzipped the bag. No rush, no flourish, just quiet compliance. He held it open, offering it like a tray. Chelsea peered inside. A protein bar, a leather-bound notebook, a bottle of water. That was all. Her brow twitched slightly. She looked up again. "Do you mind if I take a closer look?" He said nothing, just tilted the bag toward her. She reached in, pulled out the notebook, flipped it open. Inside were pages of design sketches, some in pencil, some inked in black pen, small annotations scribbled in shorthand. One said, "Corner display too cold, needs warmth." Another, "Scented airflow, ask board." Chelsea flipped past them, her mind spinning. These weren't the notes of a shoplifter. They were the notes of someone who understood the store's inner workings. But still, he hadn't said who he was. And he hadn't looked like anyone of note. And sometimes image was louder than fact. She closed the notebook and handed it back. "Thank you," she said with corporate polish. But her voice was thinner now, a hint of static behind the syllables. Shaq placed the items back into the bag, zipped it up. He was calm on the outside, but inside something cracked quietly. Not rage, not sadness, just fatigue, the kind that had no sound, only weight. He picked up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and finally spoke. "You sure you want to do this here?" The words weren't loud, but they landed with gravity. They echoed louder than a shout. Chelsea's spine stiffened. She glanced around, customers watching, phones recording, whispers thickening like smoke. She opened her mouth to speak again, but then it happened. Shaq shifted slightly, and as he did, his wallet slipped from the bag's side pocket and hit the floor with a soft thud. It landed face up. A platinum card peeked out, sleek and metallic. The logo of Verite Lux was engraved into its surface, distinct, irrefutable, reserved for the highest tier of internal executives. Below it, a name in clean embossing. Shaquille O'Neal, executive co-founder. The air in the room changed. Chelsea stared at the card. Her eyes widened, just barely, but enough to betray her shock. Around her, a few nearby customers caught the moment. One whispered, "Oh my God, that's him." Another murmured, "Wait, he owns this place?" Chelsea blinked. Her throat tightened. For one fleeting second, doubt flooded her expression. Her posture faltered, just a fraction. And in that flicker of hesitation, the entire narrative unraveled. She glanced back up at him. His expression hadn't changed. No smirk, no revenge, just the stillness of a man who had endured this scene one too many times in one too many places. She reached for the professionalism she had polished for years, and tried to reclaim authority. "I wasn't aware," she began, voice a shade softer. But something inside her resisted yielding. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of losing face in front of her team. Or worse, the audience now holding tiny cameras. Her tone sharpened again, defaulting to formality. If you're affiliated with the company, I'll need to verify that through corporate channels. Shaq didn't flinch. Go ahead. Chelsea looked around, her control slipping. Griffin was standing by now, pale, unsure of what to do. Another staff member had joined, pretending to tidy a display but clearly eavesdropping. The cameras, still rolling. The crowd, still there. This was no longer a bag check, it was a reckoning in real time. High above, on the mezzanine level that overlooked the store floor, the man in the tailored navy suit leaned against a railing, his expression unreadable. He'd been there for 10 minutes, saying nothing, intervening in nothing, watching, calculating. He pressed a button on his phone and walked toward the elevator. Back on the floor, Chelsea hesitated once more, the moment now dragging too long. She bent, picked up the wallet, and handed it back to Shaq. I apologize if we misjudged the situation, she said with all the frost of someone trying to bury fire. Shaq took the wallet. You didn't misjudge the situation. You judged me. Chelsea's mouth opened slightly. No defense came. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. But his presence, his unflinching, steady presence, was louder than any escalation. He turned slowly, walked toward the north wing of the store, past the watch gallery and private lounge door, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The false mirror had cracked. Behind him, Chelsea stood frozen. Her hands trembled slightly against the tablet. Her mind raced, not just through the embarrassment, but the realization she hadn't just accused a man of theft. She had tried to humiliate the owner of the very space she was hired to protect. And she had done it in front of 100 witnesses, and likely millions online within hours. In the shadows of the mezzanine, the suited man exited the elevator and began walking toward her, his expression calm, unreadable, but his purpose unmistakable. Chelsea didn't know his name yet, but she was about to. Because the mirror she'd been polishing for years had finally shown her what she hadn't seen coming. And the reflection staring back wasn't just Shaq's. It was her own. The moment the platinum card hit the floor and the cameras caught Chelsea Rourke hesitating, the incident ignited online, like dry leaves meeting a spark. Within minutes, the store's branded location was trending on social platforms under hashtags like Big Shaq Mistaken, Profiling in Luxury, and Verite Shame. Clips circulated in real time, edited, captioned, dissected frame by frame. One version replayed Shaq's soft question on a loop. You sure you want to do this here? It hit hard. It hit everywhere. The world was watching. Inside the store, however, a silence had settled. Not peaceful like before. This was the silence before detonation. Shaq had moved without resistance when Chelsea, now visibly shaken, requested he speak privately with store management. Her voice was calm, but her words were brittle. He followed with quiet dignity, past the perfume counters and VIP lounge, down a narrow corridor employees rarely entered. The walls here lost their gloss, white plaster replaced marble, the air less perfumed, more recycled. They stopped outside a sleek, dark wood door labeled Executive Office, authorized personnel only. Chelsea swiped a badge and the door clicked open. Inside, the space was minimal but elegant. A large oak desk dominated the center. Abstract art adorned the far wall. One corner held a curated shelf of product samples and design references. There were no windows, no noise, just the hum of power, contained, sterile. Shaq stood silently as Chelsea gestured toward a leather seat. He didn't sit. She did. He watched her fumble with her tablet, pretending to access something urgent. She wasn't ready to speak, and he wasn't in a rush to help her. Then the door opened again. A man stepped in, tailored navy suit, salt and pepper beard, crisp black tie. His walk was smooth, confident but cautious, like someone used to entering rooms where truth lived behind silence. He closed the door gently behind him and gave a brief nod to Chelsea, then shifted his gaze to Shaq. It lingered a beat too long. Shaq's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Good afternoon, the man said evenly, offering no handshake, no name. I'm the regional director for this division. I understand there's been a... Shaq didn't respond. Chelsea rose, trying to reclaim poise. Mr. Creed, we had an unidentified man on the floor without credentials. Staff followed standard protocol based on observed behavior. Donovan Creed's eyes flicked to her. I reviewed the footage. It wasn't exactly standard. She blinked. Sir, I had probable cause to... He raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. Thank you, Miss Rourke. I'll take it from here. Shaq finally spoke. So that's what we're calling it. Creed turned back to him. Expression unreadable. Calling what, sir? Shaq stared for a moment. Long enough to register the performance. So that's how he was playing it. He nodded slowly. You don't recognize me, Donovan? Creed tilted his head. Should I? Chelsea shifted awkwardly in her seat, eyes bouncing between them. The tension was now something physical, something sharp in the air. Shaq didn't press. He knew this game. He understood that Creed, his old friend, wasn't here to reconcile. Not yet. He was here to see how deep the rot went. To test who would bury themselves when left without a flashlight. No problem, Shaq said finally. Let's keep going. Creed walked behind the desk, fingers tracing the edge. As he rounded it, he stood instead of sitting, folding his hands behind him like a principal ready to deliver judgment. He looked at Chelsea again, then at the camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the room. I've spoken to corporate, Creed said. Given the profile of the individual in question, and the public nature of the incident, we have to respond swiftly, but discretion is key. Chelsea nodded, relief creeping into her features. She thought she was being protected. Creed turned to Shaq. As of this moment, sir, I'm going to ask that you leave the store premises. A company car will escort you wherever you'd like to go. Shaq blinked, but his expression didn't change. You're asking me to leave? Yes. Chelsea exhaled. Subtle but noticeable. Shaq stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them. Not with threat, with truth. You want me to walk out that door like I've been trespassing in a place I built, he said. You want me to give them the image they're hoping for, compliance with shame, so you can clean it up quietly. Creed didn't respond. He stood still, the only giveaway a slight shift in his jaw. Chelsea cleared her throat. If you're associated with the company, we can verify your credentials later. Shaq's laugh, soft, tired, cut through the room. He reached into his bag, pulled out the leather notebook, and tossed it gently onto the desk. It landed open on a page with sketches of the store's original floor plan. His notes dated and initialed. Beneath that, a printed memo with the original partnership agreement. His name signed beside the founders in unmistakable ink. I'm not associated with it, Shaq said. I birthed it. The silence was now weighted. Chelsea went pale. Creed remained motionless. But still, he didn't break character. I understand how this looks, Creed said slowly. But public clarity will come. Internally, we need time to investigate. Shaq raised a hand. Save it. He took a step back. His face didn't show anger. It showed something more dangerous, understanding. I've seen this before, he said. When silence becomes policy, when reputation matters more than reality. And then, almost like his mind reaching back to a quieter time, the room dimmed in his memory. A gym. 2 college kids. One tall and unstoppable, the other wiry, fast-talking, full of dreams. Late nights at the courts, cheap takeout in the dorms, and one night, a downtown diner that turned them away. Told them to leave, but only told one of them. Creed had wanted to argue. Had raised his voice, and Shaq had put a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back, whispering, they already decided. Don't hand them the rest of your dignity. They'd walked away in silence, but the lesson had been loud. Now the roles had reversed. Shaq turned for the door. As he reached for the handle, Creed finally spoke again, but not with authority, with something closer to apology. I'm testing them, Shaq, he said. You know why? Shaq paused, hand still on the knob. I know, he said. Just be sure you're not failing the test too. He opened the door and walked out. Behind him, Chelsea stood frozen. Creed sat down, finally, his fingers tracing the open notebook. Outside the office, employees stood like statues. Griffin was among them. His face was flushed. He looked at Shaq not with guilt anymore, but something heavier. Regret. Shaq didn't stop. He kept walking, back toward the main showroom, past the same marble floors that had gleamed with promise, past the same perfume that now smelled like performance. As he stepped outside into the open Chicago air, the wind hit his face. Cold, free, honest, and somewhere in the distance, another phone pinged with a notification. The clip had just hit 1 million views. Shaq walked in silence, the echo of it stretching inside him. No horns registered. No passing conversations cut through. His breath moved steady, but deep in his chest, the ache bloomed slow, like bruises that hadn't surfaced yet. Not from the accusation. He'd worn those before, not from the silence of those who should have spoken. That too he'd long since stopped counting. But from the old ache, the one that returned whenever dignity was made conditional. When presence became provocation. When your worth had to show ID before your name could speak for itself. He passed a mural on the side of a building, the kind that showed a young black boy flying through the air in a comic book cape. The image blurred in his vision as he kept walking, not fast, not angry, just heavy. The weight of memory pressed down like city fog. Newark. He was 8, and the grocery store near their block had just opened a new self-checkout. Lucille had handed him a crumpled 5 and asked him to go buy milk. He was tall even then. Tall enough that adults mistook him for older. He'd walked in proud, picked up the carton like a man on a mission. Then a cashier had stopped him. Accused him of hiding candy in his jacket, made him turn out his pockets, called him boy like it was a curse. He hadn't cried, not until he got home and Lucille saw the milk shaking in his hands. She'd pulled him close, kissed the top of his head, and said, "You did everything right, baby." But sometimes the world sees what it's afraid of, before it sees the truth. The truth. That word had carried weight his whole life. On the court. In the boardroom. In every room where power didn't recognize quiet strength. Until it was too late. Back inside Verity Looks. Tension still lingered in the corners like trapped steam. Chelsea had vanished behind a locked office door. Her jaw clenched tighter than her high bun. Griffin hovered near the men's section. Eyes distant. Hands twitching at invisible threads of guilt. But it was Kendall, barely 24. Fresh-faced. Still new enough to believe in integrity. Who was pacing in the inventory alcove. Heart pounding harder than it had all year. She had watched the incident from a distance, had seen the phone cameras, the twitch of uncertainty in Chelsea's eyes, the way Griffin had backed off the moment that platinum card hit the floor. It had all played out like a silent confession. And now Kendall couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had unraveled right under everyone's noses. She tucked herself behind a storage rack, pulled out her company-issued tablet, and opened the internal employee directory. Her fingers moved fast. She wasn't supposed to have access to high-level data, but she'd found a back door once during onboarding training. Just curiosity, she had told herself. Now it felt like responsibility. She typed, "Shaquille O'Neal." For a beat, nothing. Then the screen refreshed. Shaquille O'Neal, executive founder, Verity Looks Holdings, status, active, access level 1, founder ID. Her breath caught. She scrolled further. Internal memos. A digitized signature on early partnership papers. Archived emails about original design concepts. Sketches, notes, all signed by the man who'd just been accused of shoplifting. The man whose bag had been searched in front of a crowd. Chills rippled across her skin. She looked up, half expecting someone to be watching her. But the alcove remained still. Kendall tapped into the secure corporate messaging hub and drafted a message to the internal compliance officer. She hesitated, then hit send. The system encrypted it automatically and shot it up the ladder. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but she had to do something. The silence inside the store was louder than what happened on the floor. Across the hallway, Chelsea stared blankly at her computer monitor. The security footage feed blinked across multiple small windows. A slow sweat rolled between her shoulder blades. She didn't blink, didn't move. Then her fingers found the keyboard. 1 tap, 2, 3. She highlighted the footage time-stamped from earlier. Shaq's arrival, the confrontation, the card falling. Her finger hovered over the delete key. She hesitated. For the first time in years her certainty faltered. But the fear of exposure, of being the face of scandal, of public disgrace, it burned hotter than guilt. She pressed the key. A warning flashed. This footage will be permanently erased from all archives. Continue? She clicked yes. The files vanished. She stared at the screen, breathing in shallow bursts. If anyone found out, she could lose everything. But if the footage stayed, she'd already lost. She shut the monitor off and leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, trying to quiet the storm inside her. Miles away, the wind shifted outside a quiet brownstone in Orlando. Lucille O'Neal sat on the porch, phone to her ear, rocking slowly in her wooden chair. The news had already reached her. Calls, texts, messages pinging from friends and distant relatives. Her voice was low, steady, as it always had been. "I saw it, baby," she said. "They did you like you ain't never stepped foot in that place." Shaq's voice came soft through the line. It wasn't about the place, Mama. No, she said. It was about who walked through it. There was a pause. She rocked once more, the creak of the chair like an old heartbeat. The world still ain't ready for your quiet strength, Shaquille, she said. They don't know what to do with a giant who don't roar. He didn't respond, just listened. That had always been their rhythm, her voice, his stillness. But you keep walking tall, she added, 'cause the higher they stack the doubt, the harder they fall when they finally look up. Shaq sat on a bench near the edge of a frozen fountain, phone in hand, wind brushing against his face. The city moved behind him. The noise had returned, but his mind was still in that store, still in that room, still with that crowd. Mama, he said finally, I think this time, I might not stay silent. Lucille didn't flinch. Then speak, but don't speak for revenge. Speak for those watching. He nodded slowly. I got you, he said. Back inside Verite Lux, Kendall returned to the floor. She watched the energy shift subtly, customers pretending nothing happened, staff trying to scrub the tension with fake smiles. But beneath it all, something had cracked, and the crack wasn't gonna close quietly. In the corner, Griffin caught her eye. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, an apology, maybe, but the words didn't come. Not yet, maybe not ever. Behind the scenes, her encrypted message was already flagged by the compliance team. It had triggered an internal audit. The first domino had fallen. The truth, it seemed, was whispering through the shadows, and it was getting louder. At exactly 8 a.m., Chelsea Rourke stepped off the elevator and onto the executive floor. She wasn't told why she was summoned. No one had offered her an explanation. But she knew before the night had ended, before she'd deleted the footage, before she'd turned off her phone to avoid seeing her own face across social media reels, stitched beside words like entitled, racial profiling, an epic mistake. Her blazer was immaculate, her makeup flawless, her heels still sharp, but something about her felt unsteady. Her steps didn't echo with confidence the way they once did, they just echoed. Griffin arrived moments after. His face was drawn, pale, eyes shifting in rapid glances like he was still playing out yesterday's confrontation in his head. He didn't speak to Chelsea. He didn't even nod. They entered the boardroom in silence. Kendall was already seated at the far end of the long walnut table, shoulders back, expression calm but unreadable. She offered a polite smile as they walked in. Not warm, not cold, just there. The room smelled of cedar and tense anticipation. 12 chairs, 11 filled. The executive team, corporate compliance officers, legal advisors, public relations heads. They all sat in pin-drop silence, hands folded, eyes tracking movements like security cameras. The door shut behind the last person. The lights dimmed, and the final chair remained empty, until it wasn't. Shaquille O'Neal walked in, dressed in a dark navy suit that moved like it belonged on a man born to wear power. His frame filled the doorway, before he even stepped through it. Crisp white shirt, silver cufflinks, polished leather shoes, no hoodie, no casual swagger, no explanations, just presence. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just walked to the head of the table, pulled out the final chair and sat down like he had been doing it his entire life. Because he had. The silence was deeper now. He let it stretch. Then he pressed a single button on the tablet before him. The mounted flat screen at the front of the boardroom flickered to life. A date, a timestamp, a silent video feed from the security room's camera interface. Chelsea's blood went cold. Shaq pressed another button. The audio kicked in. It was her voice. Suspicious male in the men's shoe section. Oversized hoodie, gray sweats. Possible loitering. Possibly scouting merchandise. Then a reply. Griffin's voice, softer. He's calm. Not taking anything, just looking around. Another voice layered in, a whispering associate behind her. She said he didn't look like he belonged. The screen froze. Shaq leaned forward, fingers laced together in front of him. I recovered the footage, he said. His voice was steady, low, but carried with it the weight of consequences. And the audio. I also received an internal alert from our compliance channel. Filed anonymously. Kendall's expression didn't shift, but she sat up just slightly straighter. The narrative's already out there, Shaq continued. The world saw what they saw on the floor, but the story behind it, the system behind it, is what we're here to address. He turned his head toward Chelsea. Miss Rourke, do you have anything you'd like to share before we proceed? Chelsea opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't look at the screen. Her voice, now recorded in public, sounded alien to her, cold, presumptive, hollow. I made a mistake, she said at last. I misread the situation. And I— No, Shaq cut in. Voice like granite. You didn't misread. You read it exactly as you were conditioned to. The room went still. You saw a man in casual clothes. Big, black, unfamiliar. And your first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was control. She looked down. Her hands were clenched together in her lap, the skin along her knuckles white. But this isn't about humiliation, Shaq added. I'm not here to destroy careers or shame people. I'm here to force this company to face itself. Because I didn't build Verite Lux to be another gatekeeper. I built it to break gates, and what happened on that showroom floor told me we've lost our way. He paused, letting his words settle like dust. Griffin, he said, turning his attention. You shadowed me, challenged me, didn't recognize me. Why? Griffin shifted uncomfortably. Because you didn't look like someone who should be there. Shaq nodded. That's honest. Thank you. And it proves the point. Appearance still outweighs access. Perception still outruns reality. But here's where the truth diverges from tradition. He stood. I'm not firing you, he said, looking directly at Chelsea. Any of you. There were murmurs of surprise around the table. Griffin blinked. Chelsea's eyes lifted slowly. But there will be consequences, Shaq continued. Not for revenge, for redemption. He tapped the tablet again. Another slide appeared. Mandatory DI training program. Facilitator Shaquille O'Neal. You're all going to spend the next 6 weeks learning what it feels like to be seen first and misunderstood second. You're going to confront the filters you see through, the ones no one trained you to question, and I'm going to lead it. Not a consultant, not a checklist. Me. He stepped away from the table, now pacing slowly, deliberate. I'll bring in voices you've ignored. I'll show you the history hidden between luxury aisles. And when we're done, you won't just apologize to me. You'll apologize to everyone who's ever been made to feel lesser in a place designed to make people feel more. He stopped. And yes, there will be a public statement. Chelsea will deliver it. You'll stand in front of the very door where you stopped me and own it. Not as a victim of bad optics. As a professional taking responsibility. Chelsea looked up, eyes glassy now, not from humiliation, but from recognition. The version of herself she had met yesterday in that confrontation was one she hadn't realized she had built. Shaq turned to Kendall. Thank you for speaking up. Quiet courage is often the loudest truth in the room. Kendall nodded once, the smallest gesture of appreciation. Shaq looked back to the table. Luxury can't just be gold trim and velvet ropes, he said. It has to be dignity, inclusion, integrity, or it's just a hollow showroom. Then, without another word, he walked to the door, paused and turned slightly. I'll see you all next week. First session starts at 9 a.m. He left the room in silence, but the aftershock was immediate. The boardroom stayed frozen for a full minute. Chelsea stared at her hands. Griffin stared at the door. And Kendall, for the first time since joining the company, felt like something real had been built from the mess. Not everyone understood what just happened, but everyone felt it. The truth had arrived, and it was wearing a suit. The camera blinked red. Lit. Across social media platforms, networks and news sites, the Verite Lux logo pulsed quietly in the corner of the screen. As the world tuned in, millions were already watching before the apology began. The incident had sparked outrage, think pieces, parodies, protests outside flagship stores, and threads that dissected every moment of the viral clip. But what came next would determine if the company would sink under the weight of its own silence, or rise with something far more powerful than branding: accountability. Chelsea Rourke stood before the now iconic glass doors of the downtown Chicago location. It was the same entryway where Shaquille O'Neal had been stopped. The same space where quiet judgment had cast louder shadows than any voice raised. She stood alone, no PR handler at her side, no script in her hand, only the truth and the cost it had demanded. Behind her, the luxury store remained closed to the public, its doors temporarily locked, the window displays bare save for a single message etched into the glass in minimalist font. We're listening. The live stream began with no music, no introduction, just her. She drew a breath, then spoke. My name is Chelsea Rourke. I am the assistant manager of this location, and until last week I thought I understood leadership, professionalism, and the values this company stood for. She paused, blinking back the weight of her own words. But what happened on this floor, what I participated in, revealed that leadership without reflection is just control, and values without action are just decoration. The statement wasn't flashy. It wasn't tear-soaked or coached. It was raw in its restraint. Shaquille O'Neal, our executive founder, was profiled and publicly humiliated in the very space he helped create. And while the world saw a viral video, what happened here is part of a larger pattern that plays out every day in luxury spaces, corporate offices, classrooms, and street corners. I misjudged him. But worse, I carried assumptions I hadn't questioned, filters I didn't even realize I was looking through. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for reflection from myself and from every person who watched that video and saw a version of themselves in me. Behind the lens, on couches, in classrooms, on transit rides, people listened. Not because the apology was perfect, but because it was real, and real was rare. She stepped back. The stream didn't cut out immediately. Instead, the camera lingered for a few seconds, showing her stepping aside as another figure walked to the mic, taller, broader, suit crisp, presence calm. It was He adjusted the mic. I wasn't planning to speak today, he began. I thought maybe letting her words stand on their own would be enough. But then I remembered something my mother always told me. If you walk away from a fire without teaching them what sparked it, they'll light it again and not even know they're burning the house down. The crowd outside the store was silent. Even the press held its breath. So here's what this is really about, he continued. It's not about a bag search or a wrong assumption. It's about systems that reward familiarity and punish difference. It's about a culture that teaches us to trust the expensive suit but fear the worn hoodie. And it's about the lie that power only looks like confidence, when real power looks like listening, growing and doing better. He wasn't reading from a teleprompter. He didn't need to. We're not canceling people. We're educating them. We're not burning bridges. We're building classrooms. That's why I'm leading our new DEI program personally. Because I believe people can change. And because leadership, if it means anything, has to begin with humility. He nodded once, stepped back, and the stream faded out. By evening, the clip had been viewed over 18 million times. By the next morning, it had been translated into 12 languages. Colleges requested permission to include it in ethics and leadership courses. Talk shows debated the Shaq method of grace under fire. Politicians quoted his speech in legislative chambers during debates on implicit bias training. The company's shares had dipped at first, but then rallied. Verite Lux released a 5-point action plan: mandatory inclusion education, external audit of hiring practices, community mentorship programs, and a quarterly diversity report made public. But inside headquarters, quieter transformations were happening too. Kendall stood outside the glass doors of the executive floor, HR folder in hand. She'd been summoned without much detail. When the elevator opened, she was greeted not by HR but by Shaq himself. "Walk with me," he said. She followed him through a side hallway she'd never noticed before. It led to a smaller office, sleek, but without the grandiosity of the boardroom. A nameplate was already mounted on the door. Kendall James, Director of Inclusive Design Strategy. She blinked. "Is this? It's yours," Shaq said. "You saw what others ignored. You acted when silence was safer. That's leadership." Kendall's throat tightened. "I'm still new." "So was I once," Shaq replied. "But I had people who made space for me. It's your turn now." Inside, the room was furnished. Not lavish. Functional. Intentional. On the desk sat a binder labeled First 100. Kendall stepped in, ran her fingers across the surface, then looked back at him. "I won't let you down." He smiled. "I know." Elsewhere, Griffin approached Shaq in the corridor outside the cafe. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. Shaq turned. He didn't smile, just waited. Griffin exhaled. "I should have trusted my gut. I knew something felt wrong about how Chelsea was handling it, but I didn't step in. I froze." "I'm sorry." Shaq studied him for a moment. "Freezing ain't the worst thing," he said. "Staying frozen is." Griffin nodded. "I want to do better. Then start by mentoring someone who reminds you of who you were when you didn't know better." Griffin blinked. "That might take some work." Shaq finally smiled. "Good. That's the point. But not all changes came easy. Donovan Creed sat across from Shaq later that week. In the very office where the confrontation had once played out. The room felt different now. Less cold. More lived in. "I failed you," Donovan said, voice low. "I played neutral when I should have taken a stand. I knew who you were. I let them bury themselves. But in the process, I forgot who I was." Shaq didn't disagree. "I wanted to test the system," Donovan continued. "Make sure it cracked on its own weight. But it wasn't my place to test it at your expense." He slid an envelope across the table. "My resignation." Shaq didn't pick it up right away. "You sure that's the right move?" he asked. Donovan nodded. "You're what this place needs now. Not someone who manages risk. Someone who redefines it." Shaq finally took the envelope, but didn't open it. "I don't hate you, D," he said, "but I need to know the people at the top are willing to bleed a little, when it matters. Not just cover the cut." Donovan stood. "I'll be rooting for you." Shaq nodded once. "You always were." The door closed behind him, and for the first time in weeks, the executive floor felt reset. Assumptions had been expensive, but the truth was priceless. And as Shaq looked out the window, the city below teeming with life, movement, and noise, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the start of a better chapter. It had been 4 months since the confrontation. 4 months since apology met truth. Since silence gave way to education. 4 months since a viral clip cracked the glass around perception and made people ask harder questions. On a quiet Tuesday morning, just after opening, a familiar figure walked through the revolving doors of Verité Luxe's flagship store. No camera crews followed him. No social media influencers trailed behind. No grand entrance marked his arrival. Just a man, large in frame, soft in presence, moving with the rhythm of someone who belonged but didn't demand to be seen. Shaquille O'Neal wore jeans and a navy windbreaker. His shoes were clean but not flashy, and his gait carried the easy stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. As the doors shut behind him, he paused, not because anyone had stopped him this time, but because something new caught his eye. Above the entrance, in the space once reserved for seasonal banners and exclusive drop announcements, now stretched a mural, painted in bold, warm strokes. It depicted two figures, a young Shaq in his early teens, tall and wide-eyed, and beside him, a woman with grace etched into every line of her face. Lucille O'Neal, her hand rested on his shoulder. Her gaze, not at the viewer, but forward toward something greater. Beneath them, written in clean block lettering, the words read, "Don't judge a man by the way he enters, but by the way he exits." Shaq stared at it, motionless for a few seconds. He hadn't seen the final version in person. Kendall had coordinated the project. Local artist, community funded. He hadn't asked for it. Didn't want to be a symbol, but now looking at it, he didn't mind. He turned and stepped inside. The store had changed, though its marble floors still gleamed, and its displays still whispered wealth. But the energy was different. Warmer, slower. There was a kindness to the way associates greeted customers. Not performative, but intentional. A sincerity in their questions. A groundedness in their posture. The new hires were diverse, not just in appearance but in tone, rhythm, perspective. It wasn't perfect, nothing was. But something had taken root here, and it was growing. Shaq moved through the aisles, unrecognized. That was how he wanted it. He watched an employee help an elderly man match cufflinks to a suit jacket, without rushing him. A teenage girl asked about a pair of shoes, and the staffer didn't upsell, he listened. Nearby, 2 employees from different departments compared notes on scent profiles, laughing softly between sentences. None of them looked over their shoulder when Shaq passed. No suspicion, no tension, just normalcy. He reached the footwear section and paused beside a small rack near the back. It was the kids' line, sneakers with bold colors, limited edition, tucked in beside the classics. His eyes scanned the shelves until he found the pair he was looking for. Black with gold trim, wide sole, simple design, sturdy and stylish. "Those are fire," said a small voice beside him. Shaq turned. A boy, maybe 10, wearing a worn denim jacket and a pair of off-brand runners stood beside him, eyes locked on the same sneakers. His face held that hungry curiosity that kids get when they see something they know they can't ask for. "You think so?" Shaq asked. The boy nodded.
"Yeah, they look fast."
Shaq smiled. "You run track?" The boy shrugged. "Used to. Had to stop. My old shoes split. And Mom says we gotta wait a little." Shaq didn't say anything. He just looked down at the shoes again. A few seconds later, he picked up the box, checked the size, and gestured toward the boy. "What size you wear?" "Same as those," the kid said quickly, without hesitation. Shaq grinned. "You sure?" The kid nodded again. Shaq motioned toward the counter. "Scan." The boy followed him hesitantly, as if unsure if this was real or just some strange dream he'd wake up from. At the register, the associate behind the counter looked up and immediately straightened. She didn't recognize Shaq as the owner. She didn't need to. She saw something in his presence. Not fame, but confidence wrapped in calm. "Good morning," she said warmly.
"These," Shaq said, placing the box on the counter, "for my nephew here."
The boy blinked, clearly fighting the urge to say, "I'm not his nephew." Shaq looked down and winked. "Play along. It's more fun that way." The associate rang them up, and Shaq tapped his card, the same platinum one. But this time, no one stared at it like a mystery. No one asked questions. The moment moved like water. Smooth, easy. "Thanks, mister," the boy said as they stepped away. Shaq knelt slightly, tying the boy's laces like he'd done it 100 times before. "Remember one thing," he said. "Fast doesn't matter if you don't know where you're going. Run smart, not just fast."
The boy nodded. "I will."
Then, without another word, he darted toward the front of the store where a woman waited, watching with confusion as her son held up the box with a grin wider than Lake Michigan. Shaq stood and watched them go, a soft smile playing at his lips. He turned to leave, but paused. Across the floor behind the customer service desk stood Kendall, clipboard in hand, headset tucked behind one ear, posture relaxed but alert. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't hoping someone would notice her. She was the manager now. Not by default, by merit, and she wore it like it had always belonged to her. Their eyes met. She didn't react at first. But then a smile crept in. Subtle, knowing. Shaq gave her a slight nod. She returned it. No words exchanged. None needed. He turned and walked out. Outside, the wind had picked up again, tugging gently at the hem of his jacket. The sky was still gray, but light crept through the clouds in streaks. The world hadn't changed overnight. But inside that store, inside those people, something happened. As Shaq crossed the street, a kid on a scooter zipped past him, nearly colliding with a passing cyclist. The kid turned and shouted, "Sorry," before vanishing around the corner. Shaq just chuckled and kept walking. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. He had his peace. He had his truth. And sometimes, the man they try to throw out owns the building. Think you know what power looks like? Think again. The real stories aren't always told in headlines. They're felt in quiet defiance and dignified silence. When you walk into a place that wasn't built with you in mind, change the blueprint. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply stay visible. Stay with us. The next story might just hold your reflection.